Title: The Forgotten Asylum. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The letter arrived on a cold, rainy afternoon. It was addressed to me, though I hadn't expected any mail. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed with age, and the handwriting was spidery, almost illegible. I opened it carefully, my fingers trembling slightly, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was from a man named Dr. Samuel Hargrove, a name I didn't recognize. He claimed to be a distant relative, and he had left me something in his whilom old asylum on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town called Black Hollow. The asylum, he wrote, had been closed for decades, but it was now mine to do with as I pleased. I was intrigued. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, and the idea of owning an entire asylum was both thrilling and unsettling. I decided to visit Black Hollow and see the asylum for myself. Chapter 2. The Town of Black Hollow. Black Hollow was a dreary, desolate place. The town was small, with only a few hundred residents, and it seemed to be stuck in a time long past. The buildings were old and crumbling, the streets were empty, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. The townspeople were wary of outsiders, and they avoided me as I walked through the streets. I could feel their eyes on me, watching me from behind curtains and closed doors. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I found the asylum on the outskirts of town, a massive, Gothic structure that loomed over the landscape like a dark shadow. The building was in disrepair, its walls cracked and covered in ivy, its windows broken and dark. It was a place that exuded a sense of foreboding, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it. Chapter 3. The Asylum. The front doors of the asylum were heavy and rusted, but they creaked open with a loud, grating sound. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. I explored the asylum, room by room, each one more unsettling than the last. The walls were lined with old, rusted beds, their mattresses stained and rotting. The windows were barred, and the light that filtered through them was dim and gray. The air was cold, and I could hear the faint sound of whispers, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. As I walked through the halls, I felt a growing sense of dread. The asylum was alive in a way that I couldn't explain. It was as if the building itself was watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the presence of something or someone following me. Chapter 4. The Patients. I found the patient records in a small, dusty office on the second floor. The files were old and yellowed, the ink faded, but I could still make out the names and diagnoses of the patients who had once been housed in the asylum. The patients had suffered from a variety of mental illnesses, but there was one name that stood out: Dr. Samuel Hargrove. According to the records, Dr. Hargrove had been a patient at the asylum, not a doctor. He had been admitted for severe delusions and violent tendencies, and he had died in the asylum under mysterious circumstances. I felt a chill run through me as I read the file. If Dr. Hargrove had been a patient, then who had sent me the letter? And why had he left the asylum to me? Chapter 5. The Experiments. As I delved deeper into the asylum, I found evidence of something far more sinister than I had imagined. In the basement, I discovered a series of rooms that had been used for experiments. The walls were lined with old, rusted tools, and the floors were stained with dark, dried blood. There were files detailing the experiments that had been conducted on the patient's experiments that were cruel and inhumane. Dr. Hargrove had been the one conducting the experiments, using the patients as his subjects. He had been trying to find a way to control the human mind, to erase memories and implant new ones. The experiments had driven the patients to madness, and many of them had died as a result. But Dr. Hargrove had continued his work, convinced that he was on the brink of a breakthrough. Chapter 6. The Ghosts. As I explored the asylum, I began to see thing shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures standing in the doorways, faces staring at me from the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I could hear the voices of the patients crying out in pain and fear. I knew that the asylum was haunted, that the ghosts of the patients were still trapped within its walls. They were angry, restless, and they wanted revenge. One night, as I was sleeping in one of the old patient rooms, I was awakened by a loud banging on the door. I sat up, my heart pounding, and saw the door handle turning slowly. The door creaked open, and I saw a figure standing in the doorway, a man in a white coat, his face twisted in a cruel smile. It was Dr. Hargrove. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. Dr. Hargrove stepped into the room, his eyes gleaming with madness. He told me that he had never died, that he had faked his death to continue his experiments in secret. He had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. He wanted me to continue his work, to take his place as the new doctor of the asylum. He believed that I had the same potential for cruelty, the same desire to control the human mind. I refused, and Dr. Hargrove's smile turned into a snarl. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat, but I fought back. We struggled, and I managed to push him away. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock, and then he vanished into thin air. Chapter 8. The Escape. I knew that I had to leave the asylum, that I couldn't stay there any longer. The ghosts were growing more aggressive, their whispers turning into screams, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I ran through the halls, the shadows chasing me, the voices calling out my name. I could feel the cold hands of the ghosts grabbing at me, trying to pull me back, but I kept running. I finally reached the front doors and burst outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the asylum, far away from Black Hollow. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. I never returned to the asylum. I sold the property to a developer who planned to tear it down and build something new. But I knew that the ghosts of the asylum would never rest, that they would continue to haunt the land, waiting for the next person to fall into their trap. I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night. They call out to me, begging me to return, to finish what Dr. Hargrove started. But I know that I can never go back. The asylum is a place of darkness, a place where the line between the living and the dead is blurred. It is a place of nightmares, and I am glad to be free of it. But I know that the asylum will always be a part of me, a shadow that will follow me for the rest of my life. Epilogue. The asylum was demolished a year later, but the land remains empty. No one will build on it. No one will even go near it. The townspeople say that the ghosts still haunt the land, that they can still hear the whispers in the wind. And sometimes, on a cold, dark night, if you listen closely, you can hear them too. The whispers of the Forgotten Asylum, calling out to you, begging you to come back. But beware, for once you enter, you may never leave. The end.